Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on technocracy. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. David Smith and Mr. Dave, both of them from USA. Professor David Smith, my first question for you about this technocracy. How does technocracy differ from democracy and what are its advantages and disadvantages in governance?
Oh, sure. Great questions. I guess we should start with kind of defining it. It's really a governance system where decisions are made by technical experts, by engineers, by scientists, by other uh, really specialists rather than politicians or elected officials. The idea is that really, given their specialized knowledge, they can make more rational, evidence-based decisions for the common good on many different topics. Where technocracy is appealing in some ways due to its emphasis on expertise and logic, it also, though, goes back and raises the questions on the other side about democracy, about accountability, about the stakeholders that are involved and about their representation of those stakeholders. Uh, and how can you, as citizens, be assured that experts making decisions are truly reflect the needs and the will of the citizens of the people? And there's a lot of different ways to look at this, and some of it is really the careabouts of the citizens. Uh, this concept actually began in the early 20th century, uh, especially during the Great Depression in the United States, where the citizens were really disillusioned with the traditional political system, much like what you're seeing in the United States today. And it was an advocate for replacing those politicians. And it wanted to become a meritocracy where the leaders are chosen based on their expertise and skills rather than their political affiliation. Uh, and it really seeks to optimize the functions using scientific principles, using data-driven decisions in there. And so you begin to see that, some of the advantages of it is the expertise is made by people who are most knowledgeable. And particularly as I've testified, for example, before Congress here and in other nations, oftentimes the people you're testifying to don't really understand anything it is about the technology or the elements you're talking about uh, there. And so it can be part of it. It tends to prioritize more long-term benefits and sustainability over short-term political gains. Its real disadvantages is it lacks democratic accountability and representation, as the people are really not elected by the public. And one of the other disadvantages, it can create a disconnect between the technology experts and things and the general population. And it will tend to promote some more elitism. And it's really difficult to qualify who is an expert, who is not an expert, and can they be neutral? And can that go back and forth? Singapore is a great example of where this is implemented to some aspect in there. Also, when you go to PRC, when you go to China, you see some aspects of the Chinese governance, particularly in economic planning, where this technocrat approach is used very heavily in there, but not in all. And that's an interesting way to look at this as a topic, is that does it need to be fully implemented across all of what you're doing, or can it be implemented in the areas where it is most applicable? So Sharif, I think that's kind of answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you. My next things to Mr. Dave, like how does technocracy difference from democracy? What do you think? What's your view about technocracy? Mr. Dave.
Oh, hey.
Yeah.
Well, it was technocracy. I think we've bought into a myth that if we only apply more technology, we will somehow dig ourselves out of the hole we've dug ourselves into. But first, we're way overpopulated as a planet. We're approaching 10 billion people. When I was born, there were less than 3 billion. And so our consumerism creates products and packaging that we don't need, that we don't really want, but we still buy it. And so technocracy keeps creating more stuff. I look at transportation as one of the many areas where technocracy has taken us in a direction that we could have thought about in advance. Everybody wants their own private vehicle. Well, that's the biggest environmental expense of your life, is not just buying that one vehicle, which if you kept for life would be probably okay, but buying that one and then 3 years later buying another one and 3 years later buying another one, and then burning all that fossil fuel in order to transport yourself from one place to another place. If we'd thought about it in advance, and some places have been forced to think about it by geography, if we thought about it in advance, we probably would have said, well, let's go with public transportation. Let's not create an automobile industry. Let's instead allow people to go from place to place on vehicles that carry large numbers of people, or maybe private transportation, like an overhead rail system that shoots people from place to place in small containers. There's something called Transit X that would be awesome if we had implemented it 50 years ago, because you just step out of your house and there'd be a vehicle waiting for you. You get in it, it takes you where you want to go, it drops you off, and it goes and picks somebody else up. So that vehicle can move 1,000 families in a day or 100 families in a day. So our really sustainable future is subsistence agriculture. A person, a horse, and a plow, and not these vehicles that we pollute the atmosphere with and that we use for our leisure. So we have a problem, an overall problem, that technocracy is killing us, that we bought into this myth that we can somehow invent our way out of the corner we've painted ourselves into. But with the population we've got now and the fact that it's still growing, it should not be, but it is, and that our consumerism is rampant and growing, we put ourselves in a really difficult pickle. And so I don't know if that's the point of view that we want to hear, but it's the sad reality of our present situation. I don't know how we get ourselves out of this corner we've painted ourselves into.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Rob, how you want to define technocracy? And is there any difference in between technocracy and democracy?
Well, they're not related. They're not related at all. A pure democracy, which doesn't really exist any more than a pure technocracy does in the world. A pure democracy is where the people hold power. Russia and China were created as pure democracies. They're not, but that was the design constraint they had. They've turned into more of an authoritarian government, closer to a dictatorship than what you would consider a democracy. China is probably the closest thing we have to an operational technocracy. But again, even though everybody there is selected based, at least initially, based on competence, which is how a technocracy operates. Democracy is power to the people. A technocracy is power to the most capable. It doesn't necessarily apply to technology per se. It applies to competence. And so a technocracy is rulership in a pure technocracy is rulership by the most competent. A pure democracy is rulership by the people, not a representative democracy, which we have in the United States. That's a representative republic that we have in the United States. We haven't been able to figure out how to make a pure democracy work, I guess is what I'm saying. The China and USSR, Russia were both attempts to make that work. I think you could call them both catastrophic failures. The other examples of democracy in a pure sense, or what kind of what the hippies did in the 1970s, they attempted that. Issue was, and it was a democracy with the underlying, because they were communes, they were the underlying economic model of communism. But what was discovered is, rather than everybody that a pure communism, when it works, is supposed to be the resources go to the people that need it, and the work goes to the people that can do it, which turned out in a commune to be the people that wanted to work, and everybody else sat around, smoked dope, and lived off the people that worked. And clearly, the people that worked said, "Yeah, it's not working for me, so we're out," and the communes failed. So in the end, you've got two examples of extremes that fundamentally haven't worked yet. They've got potential. I can see with technology we might be able to create a pure democracy where everybody could be involved in every major decision and vote electronically. Practically, I think the amount of friction that would put in decision making would be extreme. If anybody's ever worked in a working group where leadership wasn't clear, you have lots of meetings, but you didn't get very little done. But technocracy has the promise, and we're working towards a technocracy right now in a certain sense. Is where you try to select people that are the best for the individual jobs. Something we're not quite seeing in the United States at the moment. So the most competent person is put in the appropriate job. There's no part of the definition that talks about compensation, but I imagine to make a technocracy work, the compensation would have to follow. In other words, if you're the most qualified person for the job, you should be well compensated for it. So on paper, a technocracy would look like it would work very well. It's meritorious by nature. You're focused on qualifications and capabilities as you apply jobs. I would argue that a lot of companies attempt to run like a technocracy where you put the most capable person in the job. As we know, they get a little bit political as you get up into the C levels of management, and often people are selected not because of their competence but because of their connections, which breaks a technocracy, a pure technocracy. But the underlying concepts are there. So a technocracy is mostly how companies try to run themselves, particularly if they're merit-based. And a democracy is kind of how some working groups function, where there is no defined leader. There might be a moderator. In fact, a democracy, a sense of democracy may be somewhat how some boards are run, where you do not have an executive chairman. Where the chairman of the board is what most chairmans of the board are. They just keep the minutes and keep the meeting together, but they have no overall greater authority. And the board then votes on every decision that they have to make without assignation. And so the board of a company would probably be pretty close to a democracy as it contains itself in the board. And that would be the most common form of board management at the moment. And then if you drop in an executive chairman, which has always been problematic, then you basically have a dictatorship. So then it floats over where the executive chairman has all the authority, the board is advisors, and then the smartest person in the room doesn't make the decision. The person with the most power makes the decision. So what makes a technocracy different is it's the most qualified person for the job, as opposed to one that's been elected to the position. The person that has the most power gets into the position. And in a democracy, in a pure democracy, everybody in the democracy, at least with regard to major decisions, has a role. So we don't really have, as I say, strong examples of democracies working in government, and no real strong examples of technocracies working in government. Might look at Singapore and suggest that maybe Singapore is pretty close to a technocracy in terms of how they run the government, but it's not pure. But I would argue Singapore is run very well. One of the best run countries on the planet, and very merit based. And so they're probably the best example that a technocracy could work, because it's their merit based method of government seems to be in place much stronger there than it is in other countries. But I'm not a Singapore expert, so that's just an assumption based on what I know about the country.
Thank you. My next question for Professor David: can technocratic government effectively address global challenges such as climate change, economic inequality? How does it work?
Well, there's not a whole lot of examples, like Rob was saying, that we can go and use the data-driven answer to your question, like as part of the whole technocrat approach to it. But there's some advantages as you look at the global challenges, like in climate change. It would tend to use a scientific approach. So you would have data-driven policies put in place. The technocratic government really emphasizes evidence-based decision-making, which is, really part of what's critical for addressing climate change. You look at the scientific data, you look at the analysis, and you implement policies based on those two things, which are effective and sustainable. One of the big things as you look at a technocratic approach in climate change is they're more likely to invest and promote technology innovations, such as carbon capture and storage, other green technologies. Some of the more technology enhancements of renewable energy. Another advantage for it is a technocratic approach would tend to promote more long-term planning. You can prioritize long-term environmental sustainability over short-term political gains. And we see the shorter-term political gains coming into place globally across many, many different countries as we look at climate change and sustainability, for example. The other kind of things you look at a technocratic approach to climate change is it is a more of a systematic implementation where you can look at taking the politics out. You begin to be able to understand that it's a process. You bring classic planning technologies to bear in processes where you don't see a lot of that really in traditional government as you're there. The technocratic approach probably reduces corruption in the climate change area because it really can promote more transparency and a technocratic approach tends to focus more on opportunities that are more science-based, more merit-based, and it really creates more opportunities to work and go back and forth between them because the transparency is there so that all the stakeholders can see what's going on. Now, there's some challenges and limitations there. There's some ethical considerations because most of the technocratic approaches do not consider all the needs of the different groups, particularly the diverse needs. And they do not necessarily value all the different communities that are there because of the data-driven approach. And there's not necessarily good public buy-in and participation. If you look at some of the places where it's been implemented, you see there's been really challenges of getting that buy-in. And there needs to be a balance between the expertise and the representation of the people. So the expert-driven decision-making with democratic principles to ensure that the policies are socially acceptable and and meet the needs of society. Those are some of the things that really need to happen for this to work in the environment, from your question. And, navigating all of these principles in climate change, economic inequality, and others by leveraging the expertise in data-driven policies and long-term planning is there. However, it must also navigate the complexities of democratic accountability, of ethical consideration, and how do you build up the public trust to ensure that the solutions are both efficient, successful, and inclusive. So, Sharif, I think that's my answer.
Thank you. Mr. Dev, what you want to discuss about this question here?
This is the story of our lives, I think. First, I'd like to talk about how it's not working and then talk about how it could work. Right now, every year, we get about 100,000 technocrats and politicians who fly into Dubai, or last year it was Azerbaijan, to meet and talk about climate change. That's COP, Congress of Parties. And those are high-level officials. And they then take the decisions that are being made, which are technologically driven, and they go back home, and somehow they hope that these are going to trickle down to the local level and that people will take action based on these grand pronouncements. But that's not how culture changes. Culture changes from bubble up, not from trickle down. And I can use my experience working in the family planning programs of South Korea, Taiwan, and other East Asian countries in the 1960s as a good example. We didn't do what China did in Korea. We, when I say we, I mean my Korean colleagues and I. There were just 2 or 3 foreigners and thousands of Koreans working in the family planning program. We didn't go, okay, you're going to have 1 child or you go to jail. Or if you have a second child, you're in big trouble. Instead, we trained 27,000 young women of marriage age, many of whom were recently married. We had 1 for every myun. A myun is the village of Korea, either in the city or in the countryside. It's still a myun. And we trained 27,000 young women to go door to door and organize Ke. Ke is a mother's club. So they would organize a mother's club in each village. And that mother's club talked about 4 things. We should individually make a decision as a couple to have girls as important as boys. Girls are as good as boys. Second, 2 are enough. Third, space them well. And fourth, get them a good education. And that changed the culture. And it changed the culture because it came up from the bottom and floated up to the top, not because it was imposed from the top. And Korea went from when I got there, a low-income country. The average per capita income when I got there was $800 a year. And the average family wanted to have 6 kids because they needed to have 3 boys. They had to have a boy for the priesthood. They had to have a boy for the military. They had to have a boy to run the business. Well, now, if you ask a Korean, how many kids do you want? They say, 1 or 2. Would you like a boy or a girl? Oh, we'd like a girl. The reason they say girl now is because girls stay and take care of the parents in the old age, but the sons leave and go somewhere else, maybe to another country. So the culture changed, and the culture changed in a very positive way because now the average per capita income is $27,000 a year. So it went from 800 to 27,000. The average family has 1.6 kids. That's not even replacement. So they're in the position now for the first time of seeing their population size actually begin to go down. They were at 30 million when I got there. They're at 50 million now and going down. If we use the Philippines as a control, which I love to do because I went there and spent 3 years, they didn't accept the program because the Catholic Church forbade them to do that. So the population size by coincidence was the same when I got to the Philippines, 30 million. Now they're at 120 million. It's quadrupled in the 60 years since I was there. The next 120 million are already fated to be born. And the reason is that even if they only had 2 kids per couple, they're still going to double the population. But no, they're having 3 kids per couple on average. So they've created a situation for themselves that is untenable in the long term. And I think that by turning decision making over to the couples, we made a big difference in Korea versus the Philippines, where we let the Catholic Church run the thing. So really, in democratic technocracies, like I think Korea could be, we have good decision making that reaches down to the village level and is couple by couple, family by family, and changes the culture. So we have to change the culture. Now in China, they tend to do things top down. I was in China in 1980. It was an underdeveloped country. Right after Nixon went to China, I went to China. And you walk around China, it was like the Philippines. It was not much going on. You never saw private vehicles. There were no private vehicles. Everything was public transportation. So they made decisions at the top that, unfortunately, I believe, created a technocracy that is not being directed for the welfare of the people, but is being directed for the welfare of a large and growing elite. The tallest building I ever saw when I was in China was 5 stories high. That was old buildings in Shanghai along the waterfront. And now there are 30-story buildings. There are cities made up of 30-story buildings. So that's why I say that technocracy is killing us. And the only sustainable for the planet, long-term method of survival is subsistence agriculture and or living in villages. Let's get rid of the automobile and let's get on to public transportation. That's one of the many things that I work on every day in my work, trying to get us into balance. So that's my point of view.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, my next question for you. What are the ethical implications of placing decision-making power in the hand of expert rather than elected representative?
Sure, and let's once again clarify what a technocracy is versus a democracy. A technocracy advances the leadership based on their capabilities. The technocracy is led by merit. It's not. They're not voted. If you're voting for people, it's not a technocracy. That's something else. And we don't have a. As I say, the closest thing to a technocracy I'm aware of is probably Singapore, but it's not pure. And so we don't. It's hard to blame a technocracy for bad outcomes since we don't have one. But or any example of a pure technocracy in the world. In any case, as we look for where a technocracy is going to be strong, is in moving against things, as you highlighted in your earlier question. In other words, global warming would be an ideal problem for a technocracy, because as David pointed out, a technocracy is going to be data-based. They don't have the problem with global warming or global climate change is what we call it now, is to correct global climate change, some people have to go through hardship. The petrochemical industry in particular has to go through hardship, and some of those people have an exorbitant amount of power, and they can change the outcomes of elections. And so the any effort to correct climate change has to go through a political process, and the people that are adversely impacted by that political process have a voice. And as we've seen, they can undermine any effort that we might take. The way to address that, of course, would be to make sure the people that are being disadvantaged are somehow compensated for that disadvantage, so they're on board with the change. We don't typically do that for some sort of reason. We actually compensate these folks for doing bad stuff, not compensate them for doing the right thing for the most part. There are some things like a carbon transfers you might argue go the other way, but you could argue that on both sides. So in the end, but technocracy is going to have issues because they're making decisions solely based on the data, and their background is you run into ethical issues, and so with technology leadership, and we've certainly seen that in the past. Sometimes you develop it. You get this engineer mentality of, well, what would happen? Look, let's try it out. Let's experiment, and you're experimenting at scale, and that can lead to some pretty ugly things if it's not monitored properly. Now, we certainly have seen companies like IBM, which is basically a company that's largely run as a technocracy, about as close as you get to a pure technocracy. The board, no executive chairman's on the board. The board is very competent, and they put in place very strong ethical rules. But be aware, I was the internal auditor at IBM, and I had a pretty decent job finding people doing bad stuff. So even with rules and regulations, the tendency to put the outcome in front of the rules is still there, whether it's for personal benefit or for benefit of the unit. And so having a set of controls in any form of government that assures ethics is important. And by the way, we've certainly seen it in representative democracies. We just had the senator go to jail this last week. And I think you could argue the current administration is a bit challenged with regard to ethics. That in a representative democracy, you have ethical issues as well. And so regardless of the format, the government type, you need strong ethical controls, because people are people, and people will act out and misbehave. And this is true of a technocracy as well as a democracy. You put people in power in both cases, and humans have a tendency to abuse power. They can be great when they're at lower levels, but now they can do pretty much anything they want. And in fact, you can probably look at Elon Musk as being a cautionary tale with kids from multiple women, of which he's not married one of them, and some of the things he's doing with SpaceX has me worried we're going to be short a city here sooner as opposed to later. But showcasing what happens when the old saying says power corrupts absolutely. I found that to be true in life, and so you've got to have a way to regulate the people in power to make sure that they don't misact, and it's for their own protection as well as the rest of us. Because when somebody misacts and abuses power, that tends to end up badly. I mean, Hitler had a ton of power; he ended up dead, and not in a happy way. Not that death is ever a happy way. So the systems tend to correct themselves, but people that really fail ethically tend to lose their careers, often end up in jail, or in some cases end up dead. So it's really good. The ethical construct is good both for the politicians and good for the citizens. I would say the citizens appreciate it more because they're often the ones that suffer in the interim. So the ethical implications of placing decision-making power in the hands of experts are pretty much the same as putting decision-making power in the hands of fools in terms of ethics. You still need ethical controls. The experts, in theory, if they're true experts, will generally make better decisions than your average elected official. But you'll still have that problem with power corrupting, and so in both systems you need a strong command and control containment system like internal audit, like the attorneys general in place here in the United States, that make sure that the rules are followed and that power doesn't lead to significant problems either for the person in power or the people they manage.
Thank you. My next question for Professor David Smith: how has technocracy influenced modern policymaking, and their successful example of technocratic governance today, or how this policy level work?
Well, you begin to see it work in an area where the policy tends to be more long-term. And because you're not understanding the role of your citizens, your stakeholders, and you really want to see how that works. There's not the accountability that you see in a traditional democracy. I love that Rob used the example of IBM, because there's times you see that in IBM very strongly of how this approach is used. There's other ones where you see, particularly in some of the divisions of IBM, where it tended to go away from this. And then you saw some places where it was run with a very heavy hand, and not a group of experts, but really a relationship, almost like a mafia, in doing some of the work there. So you've got those type of extremes when you are trying to work through this, because you see, for example, the accountability and representation and decision making might not really be there. And it really raises questions about who the experts are answerable to, and can their decisions be challenged for review? Because in many instances, people feel like they are not a part of the process, and because of that, they feel disenfranchised. And you see that. We've talked a little bit about Singapore. We've talked about China, and Robert and IBM and others. But if I go back and look inside China, you see the underground dissonance and things that are there. You see that impact in the financial part of China. And the part of your question, Dr. Sharif, what you really see there also is that the power dynamics are really very interesting, because you do not have a broad base. They tend to be narrow focus areas. And so that's part of what you see.
Thank you. Mr. Dev, what do you want to discuss about how has technocracy influenced modern policymaking?
Yeah, I think that we have a problem that, as I said, we've painted ourselves into a corner. We have to re-enfranchise people, and we have to broaden the base of who makes decisions. That's why what I do is I work in schools, elementary, middle, and some high schools, but really with the youngest of our citizens and their parents, because until they get clued in to the way that the world could be, the world won't be that way. 72% of the carbon in the atmosphere comes from households, from our demands for electricity, for transportation, for food. 72%. But nobody has asked individual citizens to make decisions about the large question of how are we going to survive into the 22nd century. Instead, they assume that we're going to somehow stumble through with the decisions that are made by Elon Musk and his friends, the people who have taken the power, but maybe don't deserve the power. And the power should be in the hands of individuals. Well, how do we get it back down there when they haven't been told that they're disempowered yet? And so that's why I think it's really important that we work like we did in Korea at the village level. That in my case, I have a program to take from school to school, not delivered by myself, but delivered by people who I train, that goes to the heart of the question of how are we going to survive as a family, as an individual, as a community, and then as a state, and then as a nation, and as a world. Instead, we have people who are at the top level saying, well, here's what you should be doing. But I think what we need is much more democracy with regard to the way that technocracy influences governance, that we are creating, as somebody just said, an experiment at scale that is based on the US example of the techies taking over. And instead, we've got to really completely re-educate our youngest citizens and their families about how they can help us to all, in the case of climate change, all go green, save energy, save water, save money, and create a clean, green future. The problem is that up till now, it's all been coming from the point of view of, here's how bad it's going to be when we do everything wrong, instead of here's how great it could be if we do everything right. And so my program is all based on the idea that we need to, as a culture, learn what a positive future could look like. And then we have to move in that direction. And at this point, the ethos that prevails is, let's let the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in this country. And I'm afraid that that's going to be the prevalent point of view for a few years. And we've got to keep that in mind as we try to democratize the decision making. And the best way to do that, from my point of view, is let's get the schools involved. Now, there is something called the Green Schools Movement, but the Green Schools Movement is sponsored by the U.S. Green Building Council, and they're only talking about the building. They're not talking about the software, the people who come and go every day, the kids, the parents. Instead, they're saying, oh, we could put solar panels on the roof of every school in the country. We could insulate the walls. We could put in double paned windows, and we'll make a lot of money. That's the U.S. Green Building Council. They're not saying we could help families at the neighborhood level to make good decisions with regard to their own use of energy. And I think when it comes right down to it, there are two things that we have to look at. It's the balance between humans and the environment. And we have to look at the man-land balance. We have to look at us, and we have to look at our resources, and how can we best use them, not abuse them, in order to extend the survivability of humanity for an indefinite period. Had we stayed with agriculture by horse and hoe, we would not have to worry about extinction. But right now, there's a clock ticking somewhere that says that we're 3 seconds away from extinction as a species. We shouldn't be in that situation. And we wouldn't be if we used a truly democratic process that allows ideas to be discussed and spread at the local level without the imposition of the people who have attained the power, not necessarily through democratic means. And that's becoming a problem everywhere.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, what role does artificial intelligence and automation play in the evolution of technocratic system?
Well, in an absolute sense, in a technocratic system, an AI would probably lead it. If assuming you had a viable AI, in other words, if you're putting whoever's in power based on their competence, AIs are quickly becoming more competent than people in focused roles. And so, and where I disagree a bit with Dave in terms of pure democracy, the problem we have with pure democracy is people are not well educated today. The number of wrong things the majority of people believe, the majority of people that are likely to vote believe are frightening. And so you wouldn't want to put an individual in power that was poorly informed. The same thing is said, you don't want to put a group of people in power that are equally poorly informed. They're going to make bad decisions. I mean, look at the anti-vax movement, for instance. It's just insane. So despite evidence to the contrary, they believe that vaccines are going to impart microprocessors in them, tracking software, and the rest. And that technology doesn't even exist today, let alone being applied in such a fashion. So AI would probably be what you would use to provide a form of highly competent government that on paper couldn't be corrupted. Now, the problem with the approach is AIs are programmed by people, and people have flaws. And we're already seeing some of the implications for that. The first AI engineer is actually doing really badly at the moment. Lots of mistakes, screw ups. It should be the best engineer on the planet, and arguably shouldn't even get the title of engineer anymore because it's doing so badly. And so while a technocratic government might place an AI at the head, the difficulty we would have is a mechanism to assure that AI was fully performant and hadn't been somehow compromised and wasn't in place and hallucinating. We've certainly seen a lot of hallucinations with AI, particularly with ChatGPT. By the way, when you look at the difference between DeepSeek and ChatGPT, one of the interesting aspects about that is China put in place error correction, a secondary AI error correction layer, so that DeepSeek is actually more accurate on everything but anything to do with the Chinese government. It is more accurate than ChatGPT is. Of course, it's got that secondary problem of being somewhat corrupted by the Chinese government, but that appears to be an overlay and may not have corrupted the AI itself. It just limits the questions you can ask it, which is still a problem, but not as bad as if they corrupted the core code. That'd be more like a 2001 Space Odyssey problem where the damn thing might go nuts because of conflicting directives. But a technocratic society would probably put AIs in leadership roles only to make sure that, in fact, they were the most competent things running the government and would be incapable if it was done right, and they would believe it could be done right because they're coming at it from a technology vector. That incapable of being corrupted. In other words, that would kind of solve what would be a painful problem for any government, which is the ethical problem you mentioned earlier. Is how do you put in place a performant law enforcement, rules enforcement entity that could act effectively against the people in power? And we've seen that. I mean, right now in the U.S. government, the President Trump has decided to try to remove all the various control structures within his government, and so that he can do things without getting caught or being penalized. And that is exactly the wrong thing to do in any government. It's particularly the wrong thing to do with people that are poorly qualified for their jobs, and pretty much everybody is selected as poorly qualified for their jobs. So we just watch. You're going to see what happens when you have the exact opposite of a technocracy and empower people that are selected for positions that are absolutely poorly qualified for them. And you're not going to find me on a lot of planes going forward. But the fact is that the AI would play a significant role in a pure technocracy once it was performant, and particularly an AGI level of AI would be broadly used in command positions, because of the belief it could be created to be ethically pure, would make the decisions without internal bias, and would be purely based on facts as opposed to feelings and gut, which tends to get us into a lot of trouble over time. The problem, of course, with that approach is it's not clear to me we can create an AI that would have the ethical consistency needed to do that role without problem, because people are programming it. But if we figure out a way to do that, because we're having AIs program AIs at the moment, and there certainly may be a way to isolate and weed out these problems, much like DeepSeek is doing on a much smaller basis with their effort. It is working for them, and it's working for them at scale, which suggests that the concept, which is one that I came up with as well, which is creating a second AI that mostly focuses on just assuring ethics. In other words, rather than just having the AI make all the decisions in a vacuum, it has a secondary AI that is simply focused on accuracy. And if it sees some bad behavior, it's hallucinating, it's making a decision that doesn't seem to be supported by the facts, it flags and kills the decision, and then forces the primary AI to rethink that with corrections until the decision comes forward. And the issue, of course, is if that secondary enforcement AI is corrupted, then it could do the exact opposite and corrupt the primary AI, even if it's not making a mistake. And so it leads to that problem. But when you've got people that are not pure creating something that is pure, there's going to be a problem in that translation. And figuring out a way to make sure that those problems don't reemerge is going to be a significant problem, because we are flawed and we're trying to create something that is not flawed. And that is proving to be incredibly difficult to do.
Thank you. Mr. David, what's your closing remarks for today's session?
Sharif, you always choose fantastic topics, and today was one. And as you can see, this is a topic with not a binary answer. It's not a black and white answer at all. Are there elements of this which would be useful in making decisions in a country, in companies? Yes. Are there challenges with it? And we did not even get into ethical challenges or regulatory challenges or any of those. But are there challenges? Yes, in there. But as we're living in a time today where the half-life of technology has gone so very, very short, you know, in just this week, we've seen step changes, advances in artificial intelligence. We've seen changes in the computational fabric in the last month that goes well beyond what I had seen in the prior couple of years. So we're in a time where technology-driven decisions and technology-driven solutions are moving very fast. Some people will say out of control. And there's some truth to that statement as well. But on the other hand, these technologies have brought us a new standard of living. They've brought us things doing that we have the efficiency that we did not have in the past. I could not see going back to a time where I did not have the internet. I could not see going back to a time now where I have sensors integrated in everything. The amount of information about the amount of being able to predict what's happening and going right or wrong is at an all-time high. So there's good to this approach and there's bad to this approach. My suggestion is what I've seen in places is that you use a hybrid approach with this and try to begin to do that. This is a side note on this, and watching some of the hearings going on right now in the United States for the cabinet officials, it's very clear when you listen to the different senators asking questions, which ones have a technical, a scientific, technical type of background with their questions versus the ones who do not. And so you see some of those elements even in a democracy and how it can play as well. So it's a fascinating approach, and it's one that I think a hybrid solution is probably the best one. So thank you, Dr. Street.
Thank you. Mr. Dave, what's your closing remarks for today's session?
Well, I think we're living through a soap opera now in the U.S., and I'm not watching much of it. I read the bits and pieces. My wife tells me she watches the whole soap opera. And it's sad because what I'm working on is transforming education from the ground up. And people say it's too late. And I say, well, yeah, we should have planted that tree 20 years ago, but we didn't. So let's plant it today. And then 20 years from now, we'll eat the fruit. And that's the problem, that we really need to start at the base, at the core, and that is getting citizens on board to understand that technology is not going to save us, that what's going to save us is humanity. And how do we become what we originally were, which is caring, loving, compassionate, friendly humans, and get away from being cyborgs, which is what we're becoming. And I think that the idea of secondary AI controlling our AI is great. It's kind of like a shadow cabinet. However, it depends on who has programmed that AI. So the way to broaden the base, to me, is to get every family to understand their role and to not rely on higher ups. I see how misguided people are in their beliefs by going on, say, Facebook, and seeing how people are believing AI images that are telling them things that are untrue because it fits into their way of looking at the world, reinforces their prejudices. So the only way around this, from my point of view, because I at heart am an educator, is let's start in kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade, and get the kids understanding logic, understanding what the real problems are, and get their parents to come along. I think the Scholastic Books book fair, which is a great thing, is a good model. And that is, you get people to come to school in the evening to learn things. But instead of having a panoply of things to learn, okay, here's 1,000 books you can choose from. Instead, we need to have one or two well-selected things that people can look at and think about and discuss and move forward on. Because real change is going to come from the bottom up, not from the top down. And we've got to start working at the bottom as well as the top, because it's when those two meet that the change takes place. And we've ignored the bottom. That's my point of view.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, what's your closing remarks for today?
Well, the underlying issue that we have with people running things is that the lack of consistent quality education in the people that are either voting or running governments, and so you get a proliferation of bad decisions. We're going to be giving those people access to technology that should, if they're used properly, provide them with better decision-making capability. But as Dave points out, he didn't say it, but confirmation bias is a major problem with everybody. And we tend to see stuff that agrees with with our preconceptions and accept that as true. And then we see stuff that disagrees with our preconceptions, and then we believe that that's false, even though both those decisions are not based on facts. They're just based on our foundation. And if our foundation is flawed, then our ability to tell the difference between what is good information and what is bad information is flawed. And we're all flawed in that way. I have confirmation bias. Dave does. Both Daves do. We all have confirmation bias problems. And training people how to do critical thinking is something that should be part of every curriculum. Yet it's part of almost no curriculum. I should point out that's not necessarily true. I believe Finland has put that into their curriculum now, and they're training its citizens. I think we've become a cautionary tale for them on a lot of things. For instance, Australia just put in place something that says that billionaires can't apply to the government, which is directly related to what just happened. So apparently we're training the world on how to do things right because we're doing them poorly, which is pretty sad. Anyway, the result is this technology can help. I mean, I would disagree with Dave in one aspect, and that technology can fix a lot of things. It probably could save us. The thing is the people that are deploying the technology have to be knowledgeable enough about the technology's capabilities and its shortcomings to do it properly. Otherwise, it's going to do it poorly. And with AI, it's the difference between Terminator and Colossus, a Forbin project. Neither one of those ended up well for the people in power. But in Terminator, they ended up dead. At least in Forbin, they ended up in living, but no longer in power, which I think was the moral of that particular story, because they were idiots. So assuring that the decisions to deploy technology are made prudently is important, because if the people in power are not prudent with the technology is a tool, and it's a force multiplying tool, and the nuclear energy is a cautionary tale. When we created nuclear energy, it had the capability of generating inexpensive power at scale. How did we first use it? We used it to blow up a good chunk of Japan first. And while I can certainly see the underlying arguments to doing that, suggesting that deploying nuclear energy as a weapon that has the capability of making the planet unlivable would seem to me to be a relatively foolish decision at any scale, let alone at the scale that was used. So again, technology isn't good or bad. It is simply a tool, in which you want is the most capable people making the decisions surrounding the tool. And a technocracy does provide the framework for that kind of thing, assuring the most competent people are in power. And understand, back in the 1930s, we experimented with technocracy. The U.S. had a technocracy movement. Canada had a technocracy movement. And then for some reason during the Second World War, the technocracy movement lost momentum, because people felt that they were against the war. And technocracy should be against war. Wars are highly inefficient. They're highly destructive. They really don't benefit either the attacker or the attacked long term. Granted, if you want to be one of them, you want to be the victor as opposed to the side that lost. But in any case, the amount of death and damage that occurs during a war is generally unprecedented. And in a technocracy, in theory, wars would be the last thing that they would want to do. They would have other ways to fight economic conflicts. The rest, but war would be a relatively low priority, because the profitable yields are low. Yes, it generates a lot of cash for the companies building war materials, but overall, it doesn't benefit the ecosystem. The ecosystem is destroyed in the process. You get a few people make a lot of money, and a whole crap load of people that lose their lives and property. So when a pure technocracy was properly set up and put in place, they would be anti-war. But that's that anti-war concept, the fact that it doesn't make economic sense to have a war, actually caused the movement to effectively go underground. It still exists at least it existed back when we elected back in 2013. The technocracy movement was still alive, kind of on life support, and mostly I think in Canada. But the rule of having the most capable people or machines or whatever in jobs isn't a bad concept. It's just the question of how do you achieve it. And in any case, when you're talking about technology, you want the people making the decisions on the technology to understand the technology, particularly what it can and cannot do. Particularly, and you don't want somebody like Musk doing this stuff, because he was putting self-driving cars on the road long before that technology was ready, and a lot of people lost their lives as a result. And so that's not what you want to have in any form of government. You want to make sure that the safety of the population. Your goal is to preserve and advance the population. It is not simply to make sure you sell as much technology as possible. That's not a technocracy in government. That might be a technocracy in management, but that's not a technocracy in government. Technocracy in government should have as its foremost goal to advance the population and to use the best means possible. It doesn't have to be technology, but if you're putting the best people in place to do the job, they're going to pick the best tools to do that job, and some of those tools are going to be technological in nature. So there is a potential to create a technocracy, and it advances forward. For instance, I think a technocracy would have us, given the nature of climate change, and we're not making any headroom, would have us building our colleges as opposed to typical cities. An ecology takes the entire economic construct of a city, manufacturing, retail, living, and puts it into a single defensive structure. And it's much easier to maintain it in the face of wildfires, hurricanes, and even earthquakes, because you can design around that. And the structure itself then remains intact despite the external impact. But we don't do that. So the fact that we're still building cities the old-fashioned way and watching them burn, as we just saw in Los Angeles, is indicative of the fact that people that are making these decisions are not the best people for those decisions, either in large groups or in leadership. And that does imply that we need to go a different direction. Technocracy could be the direction we go into, but we once again have to assure that the people that we are selecting for those jobs are in fact the most qualified and not the most politically connected, and that they're making decisions for the benefit of society, not just for the benefit of the technology. In other words, we don't want to end up with an AI like we did in the movie Terminator that has come down to the belief that the way to save the planet is to remove the people. By the way, I don't necessarily always disagree with that belief, but the fact that I'm a person, it kind of works against me, so I'm not a fan of it.
Thank you. This is an excellent discussion. I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible, and see you next week. Thank you, Mr. David, and thank you, Mr. Dave, and thank you, Mr. Rob, for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Bye.